survey here, very, very interesting. I'm going to mention just a few of the highlights, and then I'd love to throw it over to the panel and get your thoughts about this. We see that the 5 Nordic countries did extraordinarily well, as usual. Our top 4 countries are Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Iceland, while Denmark is number 8. The top 3 closed over 80% of the gender gap, which is quite excellent. Europe did quite well as well. In the top 20, we have Germany, Ireland, Spain, the UK, the Netherlands, Latvia, Lithuania, Croatia, and Belgium. The biggest surprise to me, however, looking at this, was the United States, which was only 31 and dropped from last year, from 23 last year, so it dropped 8 places in the last year, which I find quite phenomenal, and we're going to explore that in a moment. But just in case you missed the point, or just to put that in context, the U.S. is well behind countries including Latvia, Lithuania, Croatia, Moldova, Lesotho, and Namibia. And fans of Borat will appreciate this. The U.S. is only 1 spot ahead of Kazakhstan. So, in that context, I think the first question has got to be, what happens in the United States? Why did it fall? Ricardo, would you like to take a stab at that one?
I don't know if I have a comparative advantage at that. I live in the U.S. but look at third world countries mostly. So, but the U.S. ranks very poorly in political participation of women. I think it's only 13% of Congress that is female, and they do quite poorly in labor force participation, not in labor force participation, but in relative incomes between men and women, where there's very, very big gaps. And I think those 2 elements are what explains formally the ranking. Probably the change between the years is everybody else has not stayed constant. People have been changing, and other countries have moved ahead.
I wonder, Beth, if you could comment a little bit on whether this is something you see in the business world. Do you see this playing out? Is this an issue as far as you can see?
Well, I mean, I think clearly in the business world, progress is being made. I mean, we see that. There's clear evidence of it. But at the glacial speed we're at, progress isn't being made swiftly enough. And I think all of us in the business world have to challenge sort of the inherent limitations of the business model itself. Is the way the business model works and the incentives in it designed to, when the inevitable choices that women have to make, the system discourages them from staying in the labor force? And I think that that's a serious problem.
There is some evidence, which doesn't come here, you can't see it, but it was raised in the questions that Ricardo raised about how do you explain the differential in male-female earnings. And it's clearly the case that in the U.S. some of the explanation is different career choices, but some of it really is because of the phenomenon of lost income by taking time out. So it's the off-ramp phenomenon, moving out of the labor force for a while, then moving back in, and never making up the lost income. You don't get back to the track that you were on. So I think whereas there are some studies which sort of suggest that women who just sort of stay on the track, if they start, say, with a tertiary degree and stay on the track, they end up with very little income differential relative to their male counterparts. So it's, in fact, one of the interesting things I saw recently was a study which suggested that you start out with people who have advanced degrees, and actually women who leave the labor force, then when they come back, they take the biggest hit, because their advanced degree would have given them a very good income earning trajectory, but when they leave, when they come back, they don't get on the trajectory. So I think those are the kinds of things you can't see here. You can look at the data for a country, you can look at all of it. I think an important thing to say is that this includes a lot of indicators in addition to the ones we used in the indices for each country. And you can go and get more information, but you can't get that kind of information because we're trying to keep the information at a level that's available for everybody. And
I think the double whammy to what you say is that in the off-ramps, when they do come back on, yeah, they're forever behind in sort of that wage gap. But it's also the on-ramp phenomenon, which is many women who take the off-ramp, society's not making it easy for them to take the on-ramp back in. They haven't stayed skilled, and it's very difficult.
Is there anything we can learn from the countries that are at the top of the rankings? Do they have a better system? Is it a cultural phenomenon or a governmental phenomenon that allows them to close that gap?
Yeah. I think that on this issue of the U.S., a lot has to do with the strength of the Social Security system. The fact that what type of care there is for daycare centers and so on, that allow women at what speed they can get back to the labor market is an important determinant of these elements. I am encouraged, however, at some studies that have been done looking at the marriage market and the formation of families. Because now you have an increasing, inevitably, in the U.S. there are more women college graduates than men college graduates. So on average in the U.S., women marry down. Women marry men on average with less education than they have, especially with the younger cohorts. And this does not capture this cohort dimension. So in the younger cohorts now you have women more educated than their husbands, and a portion of them have more income earning capacity than the husband. So now the family negotiation starts changing, right? Because within a bargain, everybody can bargain something that has to do with what they would get if they left the bargain, their outside option. And so now you have women that have better outside options than their husbands. So they don't have to get divorced to impose a better sharing of the power within the family. And so we are now finding an increasing number of men who stay at home while women go to work, because they have better income earning capacity than the husband and so on. So I think those elements are in American society, but they will take some time to evolve.
So you think the economic change will ultimately drive social and cultural changes?
Well, I am hopeful that the educational dimension will drive important changes. And the fact that women will have higher income earning capacity. There's also a trend for these wage gaps, controlling for education, to come down over time.
Yes.
It used to be that, back when
Yes.
people were working with their brute force, you had to be a man to do some tasks, supposedly. Well, now people would push buttons, right? So that is no longer a differentiating element.
It's even better because now we live in a knowledge economy. So the fact that women are in how many countries?
83 out of 100.
83 out of 100. They're better prepared for the knowledge economy.
So those social changes will be coming, but how to create an environment that is more women friendly is a huge issue. In Latin America, where I come from, the problem is that labor codes were written by men. And men want to work from 9 to 5.
Right.
Women want to work more flexibly, and the legislation prohibits flexibility. So I don't know how many issues, thinking back to the U.S., have to do with this lack of support more generally for child rearing and so on.
I think that's a huge issue. I mean, I think if we wait until, the fact that women may be able to earn more than men, so men stay at home, if we wait for that to make a difference, we'll probably destroy our planet first.
It's a long time.
I mean, I really believe flexibility is so critically important. Because women define success. I actually just came back I took a red-eye back from San Francisco this morning. The last 2 days I actually we had our entire global leadership team into San Francisco from around the world, focus on talking about inclusiveness in 2 dimensions, gender and cultural inclusiveness. 2 days, incredibly complicated discussions. And the one thing that is abundantly clear is that women define success holistically, professionally and personally, and they look at it as a package. So if we don't talk about flexibility, we'll never
One of the interesting questions one can ask oneself, because it started with the issue of why the northern countries do well, is my guess is that most of the legislation there was written by men too, so I can't explain. Well, no, some of the more recent legislation, but the fact that, you started with the Social Security system in the United States, broadly defined, the social welfare. We do not have paid maternity leave. We don't even have compulsory unpaid maternity. We refuse to tell companies, the business sector, what to do at all. And, basically most developed countries have paid maternity leave. And a lot of them, the Nordic countries, have paid paternity leave. And you can choose. And I think that is a huge issue. And I guess I also agree that although I sort of think there may be some improvements in the dynamics in families as a result of different income, we've got to deal with the social policies faster than that.
Are there other policies that you can pinpoint that you think should be changed in addition to maternity, paternity leave?
Well, I do think that we also have a huge amount of educational information now which suggests that it's critically, success factors in high school date back to what happens to you when you're 3 and 4 years old. I think we should be doing a lot on serious preschool support. So it's not just, it really is, to use the word, it's a holistic approach to early childhood and how society treats that very important part of a family life, but also an individual's life. And we do, whatever you can afford to do, you get to do yourself, and that's so.
I'm really intrigued by this discussion of the holistic vision of success, which is very interesting, and I'd love to kind of explore that a little more. Is that something that exists elsewhere that we don't have in the United States? Is that showing up in the survey here? Is that a part of what we're seeing?
I just think it's a gender difference.
Yeah.
I hear our women from Beijing and Shanghai describing success the exact same way I hear women from Richmond, Virginia describing success. It is, they define success based on what they do professionally, what they do personally, what they do in their family, and it's all together. And they don't compartmentalize.
And will that ever cross over? Do you see that ever happening? Or do you think that there's a gender difference, we have to just recognize the gender difference and find other ways to bridge this gap that we're seeing in the study?
I think we have to recognize that is a definition of success. And we run our businesses to a different definition of success. The entire business model is geared to a different definition.
So in your view, the prescription would be what, to change the business model to this other definition of success?
Yes.
And so what kind of specifics would that include? That would include the kinds of things you're talking about with maternity leave, with
flexibility. Huge efforts around flexibility, so that people can get the right holistic, aspects of their life in place. That would entail child care policies.
And the education that you're talking about as well?
I mean, just think maternity leave, paternity leave for a second. We have evidence that in Latin America at least, women of childbearing age have a much tougher time getting a job. Because, the liability for paying the maternal leave falls on the company, right? Now, if there was paternity leave, that would automatically eliminate the gap, right? Because last time I checked, women could have like 1 baby a year, more or less. But men can have many more.
I think we need to call it constitutional convention just to rewrite all the laws.
That's quite brilliant.
I think it's important that we here also, I'm glad you brought up Latin America, so I don't want to, we really do need to pay attention to what Ricardo said in his comments, which is that different countries have to focus on different things. So I happened to mention India in my remarks. I just came back from a fabulous trip to India, and India has basically been taking off, and its growth rate is in the order of 10%, and people are getting very enthusiastic about India's long-run growth potential. It's got a huge literacy for women problem in the countryside, just huge. And that's why if you look at its ranking, in lots of other ways it would be highly ranked in terms of competitiveness or sort of, the service sector. We think of modern India and the information technology sector, but it in health and in particular in literacy for women, that is what it needs to work on. So what is important about this index is it tries to look at these 4 different, very important dimensions. And I think you said it, Ricardo, you've got to start with, you have to have a healthy female population, you have to have an educated female population, then you have to give them opportunities to participate, which really, and then earnings, and that really comes from the kind of thing we're talking about. Participation, because you can do it flexibly or with childcare. You don't have to give up earnings to have children. And then advancement, because we try in the earnings in the economic area to say it's not just participation and it's not even just earnings, but can you get into the top positions of power? I mean, that's yet another dimension where a country can look and say, God, we're doing okay on the labor force participation, but we're really not too good in terms of women having high-paying opportunities at the top of the ladder. And, of course, in politics, we need to do more. We wish we had more measures. Right now we have very high-level political measures. And some countries do very well on that score, certainly compared to the U.S.
And that's where I think the cultural issues are so significant. 70% of our workforce in China are women. When you look at our executive ranks, it's just awful. And part of that is cultural. The woman's place is to be in the home culturally. And so it's okay for them to participate in the workforce, but only to just so far. And then their place is to be home. So even flexibility there isn't going to address this problem. I mean, it's culturally extraordinarily complex, which is why a one-size-fits-all model for what works in the Western culture is not going to work in other cultures. And that's why this issue is just so difficult, I think, around the world.
I'd like to leave a few minutes for questions, but before we go to the floor, I just want to ask our co-authors the question, when we look at the best countries, and we see that the gap is closing, but we're still, at 80% at best. And my question for you is, do we see a time in our lifetimes, and if so, when will we reach 100%? Maybe it's Saadia's lifetime.
Yeah. Whose lifetime are we talking about? Basically.
I think Saadia, she's young.
Yeah, Saadia's the one to ask this question to.
All right, Saadia, what do you think?
Well, I come from Pakistan. I'm not sure we're going to be seeing that gap closing anytime soon, not in my lifetime. But of course, that's something that we're hoping through this report will be addressed by policymakers. It does act as a catalyst for change. It's just been a few hours since we've launched this report. We have so many questions from Yemen, from Turkey, from Pakistan. And if this can help make those changes, I'm not sure if we're reaching parity in our lifetime, but it will be pushing towards that.
Right. Do we have questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, Edie Leverett from the Associated Press.
I wonder, we've talked a lot about the United States and a little bit about the report. I wonder whether the co-authors could talk a little more about the trends that they see in Africa and in the Middle East and in Latin America, which was briefly mentioned.
Well, you'll note that at the bottom of the rankings are mostly Islamic countries, and I think that's a very important conversation piece. Some of the Islamic countries are doing enormous progress. I think that in some indicators, Tunisia, I think, is doing better. Turkey is doing much better than many other countries, even though the dynamics in Turkey are not particularly encouraging. So it's at a higher level, but not particularly encouraging. There's a widening gap between India and Pakistan, and even between Bangladesh and Pakistan, where Pakistan is falling further behind. Latin America, I'm optimistic about, because there almost all countries have a negative education gap. There is more educated girls than boys, and I think that labor force participation is rising very quickly for women, and it's probably going to change. There's one element that I think sheds light on the U.S., which is the role of domestic help. Domestic help is very important for middle-class professional women to be able to stay working while they have children. And this is one policy decision for the U.S. Michael Kremer, a professor at Harvard, did a study for us last year, asking what would be the impact of, say, a nanny, immigration for nannies. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that if you have more immigrant nannies, you would free more highly qualified women. And that's a dimension of the immigration policy that I would like to leave on the table. That's something that women in Latin America do have, professional women, middle-class women do have, that American women don't have. And it's amenable to policy. And so I don't know if you want, how big you want to erect a wall around the Rio Grande, or if you want to think of it in that dimension of policy along different lines.
I forgot to ask you to comment a teeny bit on Asia as well.
Saadia.
One thing I want to point out, actually, I've mentioned it, but it's actually worth taking a look at. So we did for the first time here these rankings by income. And if you look at so first of all, we were trying as hard as we could to say, look, we want to divorce the income development level from equality. If you are a poor country, you might be able to achieve parity in poverty. That is, basically, it would be poor opportunities for everybody, but it would be equal. Even though we did that, it still turns out that in many of these dimensions, particularly in economic dimensions and in educational dimensions, there is a developmental correlation. We couldn't get rid of it. So we tried to sort of say, okay, well, let's look at the countries and show you that even within an income group, there can be substantial differences. So if you look at the low-income countries here, you're going to see you're going to see some of the Middle Eastern countries, you're going to see some of the Asian countries, you're going to see some of the, see Latin American countries? Actually, I wasn't able to think of any. So basically, and you'll see that there are some African countries at the top. And there, so this shows you that even within a poor group of countries, there are substantial differences. What we hope that will highlight to countries is, look, you can look at a benchmark which you consider a little more relevant to you than Sweden. Sweden may not be a benchmark that you care very much about, but maybe you do care about Mozambique or Vietnam or Ghana. If you're sitting down there in your Ethiopia and you're looking up at Ghana, well, what are they doing? So I think that's one of the things and I think the high income one was really interesting because I sort of noted that we have Sweden at the top, we have the U.S. in the middle, we have Saudi Arabia at the bottom. Those are all rich per capita income countries, and it shows you that you can do a lot of, by changing policies or culture, a combination of two, you can end up in a very different place. The other thing I was struck by looking at the numbers is this year we have a number of new countries who are coming out of the former Soviet Union. These are the kind of the new countries of Europe, if you will. And I would say that was interesting to me. A number of those countries, transitional countries now into developing states. There was in a number of these parts of the Soviet Union, in the Soviet Union era, a lot of opportunity for women, and they've managed to build on that and retain it. So just to point out that you can look at these numbers and then sort of look at your favorite country and see what kind of income level are they at, and then how are they doing relative to reasonable counterparts.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
Wait for the microphone.
Hi. Being a psychologist, Dagmar O'Connor, the psychologist. Did you look and measure this in relationship to power? Is that what we're looking at, the shift in power? Or are we just looking at the separate data? Just interested in how you...
Well, I think I would say that we didn't ask it that way. There's only one variable that directly sort of relates to power, and that's political power of a certain sort. But clearly, you have to think of education and health as empowering, and you have to think of getting to the top of, in terms of advancement in the economic sphere, as empowering. So although we didn't think of it that way, I would say you can say that as a society moves towards greater equality, what that means is you've given women more power relative to where they started and relative to men.
Does that mean that there is a power shift between men and women? And do you, on this panel here, expect it will stop when everybody becomes equal? Or is there a possibility that women will take over? And what are we going to do with the guys who don't want to be taken care of? Do they have to go live in a country where the women can't read?
Oh, these are deep. We didn't have a psychologist working with us, so I can't answer this one.
I think it's a little bit. I have 2 children, two girls and a boy. They're grown-ups now. So, but in some sense, you don't want equality of outcomes. You want equality of opportunity. So it's kind of like when they decide to go to college, what can they think of themselves as being? And then, if there's enough equality of opportunity there, they might make different choices because they have different preferences. But at least the cards would not be stacked in one direction or another.
Just let me say one other thing about that, though, because it goes. I'd like to hear your view on it in terms of business models. One of the things that I was struck by again in my while I was business school dean is the extent to which there are issues of how people negotiate and how people compete and how in hierarchies they're rewarded. And there's pretty good experimental evidence that's accumulating every day that women negotiate differently and that they compete differently. And if you have organizations that are built on the sort of male model of negotiation and competition, you're going to end up with a male. They played a certain game. The game rules were written in a certain way, and so that's what happened. So it seems to me that in thinking about this, if women have a different approach to these things, and therefore a different approach to power, that ultimately the ways in which we design these organizations are going to have to change. Now, you were talking about business models, so
that's exactly the point. It's an unbalanced promotion system today because it is skewed toward one way of behaving, and all of that needs to change.
Okay, well, I want to thank our distinguished panelists. This was a really great discussion, very scintillating, and thank you all for coming.
thank you very much.
Have a good evening.